Now, the UK has since abandoned this test, but we're still using it today in Canada. Now, for the advancement of religion, the Canada Revenue Agency requires that there has to be an element of theistic worship, which means the worship of a deity or deities in the spiritual sense. To foster a belief in proper morals or ethics alone is not enough to register a charity under this category. So, any arguments to be made regarding the benefit of religion due to the promotion of ethics or morals are irrelevant here. That's not considered charitable. Nor is the propagation of any other philosophical outlook. But for anything advancing religion, from congregations to religious publishers and broadcasters, to seminaries, to missionaries, charitable status is granted, and the taxpayer must help cover the bills. Now, there are certainly many charities with a religious affiliation that perform activities within one of the other three categories that have been tremendously beneficial to our society, and by all means should be considered charitable. But for charities whose sole purpose is to propagate religious opinions, the taxpayer bill for tax credits on donations was over $900 million in 2007. Sorry.
That's okay. Just futures.
We'll edit that out of the tape.
We write the tapes.
Excellent. This does not even include the cost of lost income taxes, lost property taxes, or GST credits. This represents an annual wealth transfer of well over $1 billion a year from the non-religious to the religious, with the justification that a more religious population is preferred. What we have today in Canada with our charity law is a situation where government has taken it upon itself to arbitrarily decide which sets of religious beliefs are preferred and which are not. Back at the origin of this law, during Elizabethan times, the Church of England was the only legally recognized religious institution. So it's not too surprising that a theocratic monarchy would disregard equality rights with regards to this matter. But now we live in a pluralistic representative democracy, so our government now extends this benefit to all major religions. Ironically, the reason for this is to prevent the tyranny of the majority. They've decided that it's not government's place to decide which religion is best because it is obviously too difficult for decision makers to maintain objectivity. In the end, any decisions made would tend to gravitate towards the self-interest of the decision makers. Hypocritically, this logic does not apply when determining whether religious belief is preferred to no religious belief at all. The decision has been made. The majority has decided that membership in the theist club is best and must be subsidized at the expense of the non-believer. As of last year's Harris Decima poll, Canada was comprised of 23% believers and 23% non-believers and 77% believers. If it were the other way around, which might one day be the case, would believers think it was fair if a portion of their hard-earned money was taken by government and given to non-believers simply because their religious opinions were not held by the majority? Of course they wouldn't, and nor do we. Now, there are many arguments for and against advancing religion in society. This is a debate where consensus is unlikely to be achieved amongst opposing viewpoints. Frankly, whether it is or not, the state should not be attempting to make that decision. If you want to be religious, you are free to do so, but taxpayers should not be paying for it.
Yes.
Well, I would turn that around a little bit, and I would say, using your own figures, if there's 23%, there's 23% who are non-religious and 77% that were.
Yes.
The 77% that are might complain about supporting United Way or some of the secular charities, which are far more prolific than churches and faith institutions. And receive far more money. So the reality is that your tax dollars are going to support all sorts of charitable ventures, whether faith-based or not. And quite frankly, I mean, I think that's an issue that really does need looking at, is the fact that government has got out of the business of providing social security and got out of the business of looking after its citizens and has abrogated that right to charitable organizations of all sorts. So that's, again, a bigger issue. But certainly, you could play it both ways. You could say the majority here is being pretty well served in terms of the dollars that have gone out. And in terms of theism, and I just want to add God or gods, I mean, there's a huge Buddhist community in my writing. There are many communities supported that are still faith-based that are not theist. I grew up in part in the Unitarian Church, which can barely be called religious. It's still considered, it's still considered a place worthy of receiving tax benefits, and a place that I genuinely believe is worthy of it because they do so much good work. Anybody can apply for charitable status if you're doing something worthy. There's no discrimination there. Anybody, whether faith-based or secular. So I'd say that. Now, I don't know if we want to get on to government-funded religious schooling, but we can in a minute. Again, and I want to highlight this, I mean, we live in a democracy, sort of, but certainly we aspire to live in a democracy, and we should. And that means, in a sense, not the tyranny of the majority over the minority, but it doesn't mean that you cannot turn your back on the majority. And what the majority wants is what gets us governments, gets us social policy. Now, part of what that majority needs to do is, of course, and primarily look after the rights of minorities. And certainly if I would see that if a group that called themselves an atheist charitable organization wanted to apply for charitable status, with a particular end in mind, or maybe many ends, housing, food banks, commercial gardens, they probably could. I mean, United Way is not religious, and that's probably one of our biggest charities. So I would just respond to my friend with that.
Sorry, not audience time yet, but it will be soon. Greg, I'll give you an opportunity to respond if you'd like.
Yeah, sure.
But I'd also like to ask both of you a sort of follow-up, which is simply this, and then we can move on to the education question. Is there a compromise that could be done fairly effectively that would allow us to keep the resources that are needed going to religious charities, but still make the law fair? I mean, Greg's pointed out that there is an unfairness in the law. Can we have it both ways? So I don't know if you want to respond to that, or if you had other things to.
Well, at first I'd like to respond to Cheri's last statement. First of all, I'm not suggesting destroying charitable status just because you have a religious affiliation. I have no problem with, a religious organization whose intention is to feed the poor to still receive charitable status. But they should be receiving charitable status on the grounds that they're alleviating poverty, or on the grounds that they're advancing education. That would include private religious schools, by the way. I'm just suggesting that granting charitable status on the grounds that it advances religion is not worthy of charitable status. It's discriminatory, really. It's rooted in history from a time when the church, when these laws we first inherited them in Canada, was in the Elizabethan times. There was one church, and it provided the social safety net for society. It fed the poor. It taught people how to read. So.
Yep.
I wanted to say one other thing. You said United Way, for example, is a secular organization. I think I already addressed this point, but they're not advancing a religious worldview. They help people out, right? Like I don't care if you want to be any religious organization should not be refused charitable status because they have a religious association. They just shouldn't be granted it because they do have that. Also, yeah, I do agree about the heritage site thing that you said earlier as well. I just came back from Europe, and after seeing, Notre Dame or Sacré-Cœur in Paris, or Casa de la Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, or Westminster Abbey in London, like, there's a lot of gorgeous historical buildings that should be preserved for their history and their architecture. And the fact that they have such a great meaning to the culture of those particular cities. I have no problem with making exceptions for heritage sites, but certainly that only applies to a small fraction of existing religious buildings. And you say also the majority-minority thing. Yes, obviously the majority does get to make the decisions. That's how democracy works. But that's the reason that we have equality rights, is so that the minority, at the very least, even if you're the minority in every regard in society, you have this minimal level of protection. And one of those levels of protection is religion. And just just because you're the majority with regards to that particular viewpoint doesn't mean that you should be able to rule over those who don't share your opinion.
Okay. One more round and then we'll launch.
Sure.